but I just want to introduce myself to you guys. My name is Deena Bak. I'm a senior here at Williams College studying studio art. Who's a first-timer to WCMA, this museum? Good. Well, I'm glad to have you and introduce you to a museum that's been a really big part of my experience here at Williams. During my time here, I've worked as a museum associate tour guide for 3 years, giving tours to student groups that come to the museum. The summer of my sophomore year, I worked as an education intern in the offices here, so really played a big role in writing and implementing tours for groups that come through the museum, really getting to learn the behind the scenes as to what goes into running a museum like this. And currently I'm serving as the co-president of the Student Advisory Council to WCMA, which is a group of students that is, I guess, working towards connecting WCMA and this museum with the campus community and the Williamstown community at large. So WCMA is a huge part of my life. I'm really happy to be here sharing, I guess, a topic that I'm particularly interested in. This talk today, as some of you, well, all of you, I guess, know, is about monsters. And it's part of a series put on by the communications department here at Williams College called Halloween Screamings. So there's been a really, really great series of events all based around horror and Halloween and kind of in an academic setting. So we've had movie screenings at Images. Yesterday there was a talk on how to do science fiction makeup and gore from the theater department. So it's just been a really great series of events, and I'm really happy to be asked to be a part of it. So besides my own obsessions with horror and all things that go bump in the night, you're probably wondering why talk about monsters today? Where's the value in it? So I thought down here I would start with a little bit of introduction as to why I think this is a valuable thing to study in literature, in art, and I think monsters really are in a unique position to teach us a lot about culture, about the nature of humans, the nature of our fears in general. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that before we begin our tour, and then I'm going to show you what's in the secret box. You should be really excited. So, where to begin? So first of all, I think it's important to note that monsters and, I guess, mythological creatures appear in every society and culture's artwork and literature, folklore, going back to the dawn of human expression itself. Actually, some scholars have noted that monsters first start appearing in art and first start appearing in folklore when writing was developed. So I think it's quite interesting that monsters start cropping up with, I guess, the dawn of human self-perception itself. So to me, that kind of implies that these figures, there's something really universal about them. They are in every culture worldwide. And there's something really vital about them, or really interconnected with human expression itself. So I think for one, that's alone makes them very, very interesting things to study. Just thinking about the forms that monsters take, I'm sure you guys have some that come to mind as your favorites or things that you've seen from horror films, but generally they fall into 6 basic types. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines monster as any creature that is a combination of human and animal forms, or second definition, anything so ugly or grotesque as to scare people. And a third using the word monster to describe size, so enormous, monstrous creatures. So that already hit 2 types. We have hybrids, things like griffins that are combinations of animals or combination of human forms and animal forms together. We have colossals, things that are bigger than us, giant. We have creepers, monsters like spidery types. There's the slitherers, you know, the snake, reptile kind of monsters. We can think of like Godzilla and things like that. Then there's a couple others, maybe specters, things like ghosts, spirits, poltergeists, that sort of monster. And then there's the succubi, the things that come and, I guess, feed off of human life forces. And these are like 6 basic types that keep cropping up in almost every culture's folklore. And I think there's a couple of reasons why these forms keep coming up again and again and why they're so universal. One major reason, I think, goes back to our evolution and our ancestors before people were even people. Things like snakes, spiders, poisonous animals, things with really sharp teeth and claws, etc., are obviously really dangerous and best to be avoided, right? Our ancestors were really concerned about surviving. So naturally, those individuals, I guess, who developed a natural fear towards these creatures, so things like snakes and spiders, had more of a chance of surviving and passing on their genes to the next generation. So you can kind of get an idea of how these natural innate fears would develop. They go back to our history as a human race itself. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the word monster. I think it's really useful in, relation to what we're going to be doing today. The word monster comes from the Latin mostrare, which means to show or to reveal. And it also has word roots in monare, which means to warn. And mostrare, I guess we get the word demonstrate, to show. But traditionally, monsters have always been, considered warnings from God. Some sort of omen or admonition to people. So in the Renaissance, in the medieval ages, when a pig was born with 2 heads, this freak event, even a baby that was born deformed, it was considered to be a monstrous birth. And people took this as a warning from God that you're doing something wrong and God's going to smite you with his wrath. So monsters have always functioned as these really meaningful and active signs. They've always been really symbolic. The word monster has actually been a medical term in history to describe births that are either deformed or where the baby doesn't look like the mother. And this comes from, monsters. So it actually comes from the Renaissance, when people truly believed that, a woman's imagination and her desires could influence the outcome of the birth. So people believed that whatever the mother was gazing upon, either during conception or during the birth, would influence the outcome of the baby. So, if there's beautiful artwork in the bedroom, great, beautiful baby. But, if that mother is thinking about other things, you never know what's going to come out. But, so, history like this really, it shows us that monsters have always had a connection with the imagination, with human creativity, with art itself. But also that the word roots show us that monsters have always been symbols, really active symbols. And I just wanted to give a few examples maybe from popular culture to relate this to maybe some things that you guys have seen. Monsters have an ability, I guess something that I think is really unique about them, to teach us things about culture. They're ways that we can read a culture. They've always, shown us what a society deems other, what a society deems inappropriate, things like what is good, what is evil, what should be seen, what should remain hidden, what is inside, what is outside, things of that nature. And they also have a really unique ability to reflect, the fears of the times and the cultures from which they come. So, for just a quick example, we can think of the horror films of the 1950s. A lot of the horror films from that time, used creatures from space, giant mutant radioactive ants coming down to Earth and attacking people. We have the invasion of the body snatchers. And at the time when these films were being made, there was this really, pervasive fear of nuclear threat. And also, all the atomic bomb stuff going on at the time. These horror films started to reflect, a really pervasive cultural fear that Americans felt towards foreign invasion. So aliens actually became representative of the fears that Americans had towards foreign adversaries. And oftentimes these films, pitted the scientific elite against these creatures. So we kind of have references to the scientific, arms race that was going on at the time. So just for one example, you can see that oftentimes our monsters reflect greater fears that are going on within a culture. So with that short introduction, I think just trying to explain a little bit about why I find this subject so fascinating, and I just wanted to point out today's tour is in no way going to be comprehensive. There are way too many monsters and cultures and objects for me to talk about in one tour. So I've tried to keep it a little bit chronological, starting with the oldest and working our way up to the most modern. But other than that, it's just things that I found in our collection. WCMA's a teaching museum, and we have a really, really crazy, vast variety of objects. I think over 13,000 in the collection. So I got to play curator and have a lot of fun pulling objects and picking what I was going to use for this tour today. Liz Gallerani, who's the director of the Mellon programs here at WCMA and also runs this Rose Study Gallery, helped me select and pull out some works for us to look at today. So I thank her for her help getting us organized. So, are you wondering about the box? Yeah? So, a Halloween tour is really not complete without a mummy, right? At least I thought so. It's Halloween themed. WCMA actually has a real, really, really real mummy hand in its collection. So maybe Liz wants to... I'm pulling out all the good stuff for you guys, I'm serious. So this is actually quite a mysterious object. If you want to get up, come look at it. It's really creepy. It's really creepy. Take a look. We got skin, we got bones, we got some wrapping.
How old is it?
When does it date from?
So this is actually a really mysterious object in WCMA's collection. We don't actually know that much about it. I think there was an Egypt exploration project that stretched from 1801 to 1903. And during that time, somehow this hand made its way to WCMA. We're not really sure how it came, who gave it to us, and even details about where it comes from. So something kind of exciting is that we're going to be doing some carbon testing of the hand's tissue pretty soon to find out more about, the person whose hand this used to be, and maybe, give us more detail about how old it is. So I can't really answer that, but we should have some answers pretty soon.
Female.
Yeah. So is anyone else as creeped out by this thing as I am? No. I think it's so creepy. But so there's something really particular about dismembered body parts that really, really give us like a creeped out feeling. And I thought I would maybe talk about a little bit of Freudian analysis. Freud talked about the nature of fear and the things that scare us in a paper that he wrote in 1919 called The Unheimlich. And I thought it really related to this piece in a really interesting way. Das Unheimlich means, the uncanny. That's the closest translation that we have. Heimlich in German means of the home, of the hearth. Everything that is comforting and warm and of the family and is really familiar. Whereas unheimlich is all those things that exist outside the home. Everything that is strange and foreign and kind of uncomfortable. And what Freud wrote about in this essay, he was trying to kind of explore some spooky literature that was going on at the time, really like breaking it down and seeing, why are we so creeped out by certain things? So Freud just defined the uncanny as when things that are unfamiliar and outside of the home suddenly make their way inside. So he discussed common things that keep cropping up in horror all the time. Dismembered heads, hands that don't have a body, that play a piano by themselves, specters that are bodiless and just seem to float in space. And he talked about the fear that we have associated with these things as really separate from a fear that you might have, say, encountering like a barking, vicious dog. It's a very particular kind of fear that comes up. And of course, classic Freud, he said this has to do with the castration anxiety that all humans have. And, you know, it's classic Freud, but I think it's a little bit more than that. I think, at least something that Freud talked about in this paper, the reason why these things scare us so much is somehow when the imaginary, things that we thought only existed in our heads, come into reality. And that gives us a really, really strange, uncanny sense of fear. So in other words, I think what Freud was trying to say is that monsters, or these really creepy kind of figures, they remind us that there are forces out there that are more powerful than ourselves. Whether that's the weather, or politics, or parents, you know, that sort of thing. It reminds us that we're not God, and that there are forces out there that are just totally beyond us, and that gives us a really, I guess it checks our ego, and gives us something to be scared about. So, keeping that in mind, I'd like to move our tour upstairs for our our second segment of the tour, where I'm going to talk about some monsters from the ancient world. These relief panels are from about 1000 BC in an area that's now modern-day Iraq. They came from ancient Assyria, which was also the site of ancient Mesopotamia. You might be familiar with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that valley culture that stems back to 3000 BC. So these are some old objects. And can anyone guess what the monster is? I bet you know. I heard griffin, right? So, as I mentioned earlier in the tour, monsters are traditionally creatures that use human and animal forms in combination. So we see here, we have a human body. He's got nice muscular calves, human feet, human hands, but the head of a bird. So by many standards, this is a monster. It's a strange mythical creature. But to the people who created this relief, this creature actually wasn't a monster, and I'm going to get to that. But first I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the monsters that come from this region. We know about them because of this really great book that survived from the King Ashurnashirpal II. These come from his palace, and within that palace we also found a book which kind of chronicles all these monsters that these cultures believed in. So one of the ones that was mentioned is named Labu. It's supposed to be a sea monster who's 300 miles long and 30 miles high. And he comes ashore every once in a while to wreak havoc on man and to even scares the gods sometimes. There's a demoness named Lashmatu who is typically depicted as a naked woman with the head of a lion and talons like a hawk. And she's a barren and really frustrated virgin who attacks women in childbirth. And then there's the demon Pazuzu, who's supposed to bring sandstorms from the desert and wreaks havoc upon man. And besides these really, really large, epic monsters, these cultures also had smaller succubi-type creatures that attacked humans in very certain situations. Things like childbirth, traveling alone, crossing the desert. So I think the types of monsters that rear their heads in these cultures really tell us a lot about what these people had to fear. You think about the demons who come during childbirth, crossing the desert, being alone. These are all situations in the ancient world that would have provided a really serious risk to your health and well-being. So it makes sense that these people have fears that are associated with those areas of life, and somehow created monsters, created visual representations of these fears. But as I said before, though this could be defined as a monster, it was actually not. These relief panels are just two of hundreds that would have lined the walls of this palace. And these figures are actually called Apkallu, which are protective deities. And you see he's holding a bucket here and a pine cone. Scholars have speculated that this has to do with a purification ritual. He's blessing the palace and removing evil spirits. You also might notice there's a band of writing that goes across the middle third of both of these reliefs. And I think reading a little bit about what those say would give us a hint about, I guess, what these figures mean. So I have a little snippet here. I am Ashur-nashir-pal, the obedient prince, the worshipper of the great gods, the fierce dragon, the conqueror of all cities and mountains to their full extent, the kind of rulers who tame the dangerous enemies, the one crowned in glory, the one unafraid of battle. And it goes on and on and on about how great and awesome this king is. So you can imagine, these line the hallways of this palace, and any, messenger or foreign adversary coming to the palace would have to confront image after image after image of these really great protector deities, and also this message over and over and over how powerful this king is. And by putting the message right across this creature, he's really associating his power and his political might with these supernatural beings. So in a way, these figures act as a sort of political propaganda, where the king is associating his power with the supernatural. And that's a theme that's going to come up again when we talk about our next piece of ancient art. Oftentimes, monsters are used to associate leaders with political, political power is associated with supernatural might. So, as I said, though this figure isn't necessarily considered evil, I guess as a supernatural being, it was meant to instill fear in, adversaries who would have come to the palace. And it's supposed to kind of get you shaking in your boots a little bit about the might of this great king, Ashur-nashir-pal. Do you guys have any questions about the reliefs? Yeah.
Do you know when that was translated, or how?
I believe that the script on this was one of the scripts that was on the Rosetta Stone. It's Assyrian writing, and for those of you who don't know, the Rosetta Stone was a really key object found that helped us translate. It had 3 passages of the same writing repeated 3 times, once in Latin, once in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and I think the third was this style writing. I could be wrong, but that's how we were able to translate, so we're really lucky to have that. And these were actually some of the first objects to ever come to the Williams Museum of Art. They were actually taken out of the desert in, I believe, the 1700s. You can notice some cuts here. They were split into thirds, and each third was tied to the back of a camel and taken out of the desert. It's like a pretty great story that we have. But if there are no further questions, I want to move on and talk about another piece of ancient art that's right in the gallery next door.
A monster with somebody's head in it.
A monster with a person's head in its mouth. I think that's pretty accurate. Anybody else notice any details? We have eyes.
Head in the mouth.
Okay, so could be a dragon. It's very lizard-like, right? We have big eyes on the side, and everyone notices the human face coming out of this monster's jaws. Okay, so this piece of sculpture comes to us from the ancient Maya. And the interesting thing about ancient art a lot of the time is it comes to us today fragmented from its original context. Oftentimes artworks are damaged, they've lost paint. This one actually would have been originally painted in bright blue and red. You can actually see some of the paint residue in the eyeball and on the nose here of the monster. But what's interesting about ancient art is to figure out the original context of this piece, how the people who made it would have felt about it, what they would have used it for. We really have to use some deductive skills and look at other things that we know to figure out what is this thing. So we have a monster head, some sort of serpent, right? I've heard lizard, snake type thing, and a human head coming from its jaws. And there's a couple other areas in Mayan art that we see humans and animals together. One of those examples are masks, where humans are actually related to, I guess, an animal counterpart. So the Maya believed that every human had a mortal essence, an immortal essence, like a spirit or a soul, and a third part that was like your animal counterpart. So oftentimes in art we see humans and animals in transformation. They actually believe that humans had the power to transform into these animal counterparts. One reason why I don't think that this is what we're seeing here is often in these masks that the human head doesn't really come out of the animal's mouth. That's like pretty particular, so we have to look elsewhere. Maya believed that there were, I guess, a duality of reality. There was the world on earth and also the spiritual world which existed in the sky. And in their belief, the sky was actually a two-headed serpent that eats its own tail, kind of a unique image, but the serpent imagery is always associated with the heavens. So Maya believed that it was possible to contact this spirit world, and to them it was really important not only to communicate with the gods, but also to communicate with their ancestors who lived in this spiritual world. And the way that they would do this is through really particular ritual sacrifices. You might be familiar with Maya blood sacrifice, where they would actually sacrifice humans or use blood as an offering to the gods. These ceremonies often also involved hallucinogenic drugs. You can imagine how swirling smoke might start to look like serpents and these spirits that were really important to the Maya. But it was said that the way that you contact your ancestors or contact the gods, they would actually manifest by coming out of the mouth of the serpent deity. So I believe, and other scholars agree, that this is a sculpture of an ancestor who's been contacted through blood sacrifice and is coming to speak a message to those of us on Earth. And the reason why we think it's a human face is because it's a pretty naturalistic depiction. Nice soft lips that are actually open, as if it's about to speak a message. So really, brings association of ancestor worship and the ideas of getting messages from the beyond. This piece is a corbel, so in other words, it's the top of a column that would have existed on the corners of a building. And does anyone have any guesses about who would have lived in that building? What type of person, what status in society do you think a person would have if they had this very spiritual sort of decoration on their house?
A shaman.
Yeah, a shaman, right? So you're exactly right, spot on. Rulers, the emperors, and also priests were the only people in society that were allowed to partake in these rituals and, I guess, associate themselves with these powers of contacting the beyond. So this would have decorated the entrance to a really important building, whether it was some sort of shaman's house or an emperor, we don't really know. But just as we saw with the last piece, the powerful elite often associate themselves with the supernatural to establish their power. And here again, because of this sculpture being outside the home and these rulers and priests being the only people who can perform these ceremonies, again we see elite members of society using monsters, using supernatural animal imagery to associate themselves with power and, I guess, establish their rule. Which is pretty cool stuff. Do you guys have any questions about this piece? It's made out of limestone covered in stucco, so I kind of am curious about what it would have looked like back, way back when. I believe it's from about year 900, so very old. But it again brings up the question of whether the Maya would have considered the serpent a monster. It even says on the label here, human head emerging from monster jaws. And we call it a monster, but to the Maya, the snake would have been something really sacred and really representative of their religious ideals. So it leads one to wonder, is that a monster? what is, I guess, monster is often in the eye of the beholder, which is something really interesting to think about. So with that, I'd like to move us up ahead in time a little bit and talk about some pieces from the 17th century, which will be back downstairs. So if you want to follow me. So kind of moving way up in time, this is a painting from the 17th century. It comes from Italy, and unfortunately, we're not sure who the artist is. It's anonymous as of now. There's been some speculation about who created the piece, but it's still a little bit unclear because the style is pretty typical of the region and of the time. So I bet you guys know right away where the monster is in this work, right? Okay, so exactly. This is a painting of St. John, and it's a story that I guess John was asked to drink from a poisoned chalice to, I guess, prove the strength of his mission or how much God loved him. There's a number of different versions of this story. One, he was in some sort of a temple of Diana, who was, I guess, a pagan god in the Christian view. And he was ordered to drink from this cup, which 2 men had already drank from and died at his feet. And we see here he's looking up to God incredulously, saying, "You gotta save me on this one here, buddy." So as the story went, God, saves St. John, and the poison is expelled from the cup in the form of a serpent or a dragon. So you see here, God is expelling the poison and making it safe for him to drink. He obviously looks like pretty surprised, I think, that God's saving him. But I thought this piece was kind of interesting to talk about. Again, monsters acting as symbols in art, because here the monster, this little dragon, cute little thing, is actually actively representing the devil. It's a representation of evil. And the dragon comes up in Christian imagery pretty often in associations with the devil. And devil imagery has a really interesting history within the Christian religion. In the Bible, the devil is first, I guess, referenced in a snake-like form with the Adam and Eve story, right? They're tempted in the Garden of Eden by an evil snake. The devil is actually not described in a physical form again until the book of Revelations, written by, it was another John, but written by, can't remember, another John. He wrote about the apocalypse. And in the apocalypse, the devil is described as a great red dragon that has 10 heads, 7 horns, absolutely horrific, horrible thing. So it was the first time, I guess, in written language that the devil started to become associated with these images of scaly, reptilian, snake-like beings. So the question that I was interested in when I looked at this piece was, why dragons? They appear in every human culture, almost all over the world. You see dragons come up again and again and again. And in Christianity, we have the dragon becoming a stand-in for the devil himself. So there's a couple theories as to why people have come up with the image of the dragon as evil incarnate. Ancient people who found dinosaur bones washed up on the banks of the Mediterranean obviously didn't have, I guess, as much knowledge of natural history as we do now, and often interpreted these bones as great beasts. And they didn't necessarily think that they were extinct. You find the bones of a giant lizard, your assumption is, holy crap, there's a giant lizard out there somewhere. And oftentimes, the way that stories of travel were transmitted mouth to mouth really stretch these stories and create them, make them into really, really magnificent folklore that continued throughout time. And again, it kind of brings us back to that original point about evolutionary fears. As I brought up in the beginning, we have this natural innate fear of snakes. Is anyone here scared of snakes? Yeah. I love snakes, but it's pretty, I guess, standard for people to have this aversion to things that slither and are slimy. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it goes back to fears of our ancestors of animals that could be really harmful to us, and their fears that have been part of our evolution as human beings. So yeah, do you guys have any questions or comments about this piece at all?
I do.
Yeah.
The choice of red feathered cloth, does that also tie into devil symbolic with red, or associated with red? Or
You know, I'm not really sure. I think you're right in thinking that red is often a really symbolic color, especially in religious art. I don't know if it has to do with the devil per se, but I know that Jesus is often depicted in a red robe to denote his royalty, his blessing from God. So it could be, it could just look aesthetically pleasing against this really deep black background, but also it could be referencing, God's love and God's approval of St. John as a saint. So that's my best guess. I'm not really sure, but we have a couple more pieces left on our tour, and I'm going to take you back into the Rose Gallery where we started to look at some other examples of how monsters can act as symbols in art. And maybe we could sit in this front row of chairs or something. Yeah, this one right there. So what we're looking at here is a painting from the 17th century. We're not sure whether it comes from Iran or Turkey, but it's one of those regions with a lot of Persian influence. And what we see here is a div, or a demon. It's a pretty typical style of the period. The whole painting is pretty much monochromatic in these really light watercolor washes with really, really fine, almost calligraphic-like brush strokes. So you can see in the hair how fine those brush strokes are, made with a single hair on a paintbrush. So the style is absolutely gorgeous. This is one of my favorite pieces that we're talking about today. But this piece wouldn't have been displayed like we're looking at it today, in a mat, in a frame. These images actually came from manuscripts, so bound books that would have been owned by obviously very rich patrons, people like princes, aristocrats, people of the court. And they're meant to really be held in the lap, so hence why I asked you to come up and look so closely. They're really meant to be examined really closely and just enjoyed. So the artist of this piece wasn't necessarily trying to depict any sort of narrative with this demon. He's holding a boulder, looks like he's about to maybe huck it somewhere for evil purposes, we don't really know. But rather than telling a story, this piece was really just meant to create some sort of mystical world that the viewer could get really excited about. Oftentimes, these manuscripts would have stories like epic tales of heroes and princes, but oftentimes you just have depictions of characters, and the demon is something that pops up again and again. And this piece is particularly interesting, I think, because it truly is a great example of how the monster can become a stand-in for otherness and foreignness, which is something that we've seen already. I'll just take a closer look at the features. So who maybe can describe the head of this monster? What do you see?
scary.
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 I know. What kind of animal do you think that is? It's got a human body, right? But again, we see the composite monster, some sort of weird animal head on there, right? I think it almost looks like a dragon. Does anyone else? Dragon? Well, scholars have suggested that this head, and there's also a little tiny mini monster head on the end of his tail, which I think is a really, really nice detail. This image of the dragon head is actually a Chinese dragon, which is, I think, called a Qi Lin, if I'm saying it right. I have no idea. But it shows that these artists were really taking influences from outside cultures and bringing them in to their own art. So there was this really great cultural exchange that these artists were having at the time. Another thing, which I think really catches my eye, is the gold work in this piece and also the costume that this monster is wearing. He's got this really, really bright kilt on with oranges and greens. He's wearing bangles. Looks like there's bells maybe on his jewelry. There's a big, big bell around his neck. And this costuming that he's wearing is also another reference to, I guess, Central Asian shamans. It's very, very similar to what shamans would have been wearing in China and Central Asia at the time. So here, I think we have an example of these artists using images of the foreign, of the outsider, and associating that with the monster to really create a sense of fear in the viewer. So here, this demon, this div, literally comes to stand in for foreigners that these people maybe have no idea about. Any comments or questions so far? Again, feel free to interrupt me. Yeah, this is one of my favorite pieces. But I know we're getting short on time, so I'm just going to move on to our next piece, which is a really lovely print by Francisco Goya. Again, come up and take a look. These prints are really meant to be seen at a close distance. So Francisco Goya was a very, very famous artist. He's known for his paintings that he did for the Spanish court in the 1700s and 1800s. And he's also really well known as a printmaker. So this print comes from a series called Los Disparatos, or folly. It means like silly, kind of nonsensical thoughts. And this was a series that he did towards the end of his life. He had just experienced the Inquisition firsthand. He had seen a number of wars in his lifetime, and he was also dealing with a lot of personal illness at the time. So this series tends to be really dark. Goya's previous print series were really, they used a lot of monsters, oftentimes to comment on the political happenings of the time, to illustrate Spanish parables and folklore. But in this last series, Goya really starts to get pretty ambiguous with his images and really associate them with human emotion rather than a particular political event or story. So, again, can someone take a stab at describing what we see? It's a little unclear, and it's okay. What do you think? What do you think we have here?
Flying.
Yeah, I see a horse body. Definitely, do you guys get that? The kind of a rump right here and very obvious wings. So we have a winged horse. But I think the head of the horse looks a little strange, right? There's almost like this
like
beak, like a wolf face maybe. I see talons instead of hooves.
Why the hand?
Farther away.
So why the hand? I actually see...
Looking back. Doesn't it look like a face looking back at you right here?
Farther away
Yeah.
than this.
Right here. It's like an eye, nose, and mouth looking back at
Could be. So I actually think there's two figures riding on this horse. I kind of see like
No.
one set of pants.
There it is.
And then I think this white arm kind of thrown up with the hand is another figure. So there's not a lot of information on this piece as far as interpretation goes. But I think, I don't know, what do you guys get as a sense of mood? What is your emotional reaction to this work?
It's like Halloween.
I think Halloween.
How old is it?
The head of the
It's over 400 years old.
the head of the monster strikes me as a cartoon version of someone he didn't like.
Yeah, that could be. Goya often made a lot of political cartoons where he turned people like the aristocracy and members of the church and the clergy into, donkeys or monsters. He had a lot of great political commentary, so that could totally be true. I'm not sure what type of mood I get with this. We have a really obscure background. It's just this really, really deep black. And again, we don't see the faces of these figures, which is something else that's makes me a little uneasy. We don't know if they're enjoying this ride. Have they been scooped up by this monster? Are they just being kidnapped? Are they enjoying themselves? I don't really know. But I thought finishing with this one would be kind of nice because it lets us talk about a lot of the ambiguities that monster lore has. This is a great example of a really ambiguous monster. I have no idea what kind of creature that is. We don't even know if it's a good monster or a bad monster. The title of this piece is Disparate Volante, which means on the wings of folly. So folly is another word for nonsense and kind of nonsensical thoughts. So I think that this piece could just be Goya playing around and also, kind of expressing his own emotions as he got toward the end of his life. But monsters are often really ambiguous figures, which is something, again, that I think makes studying them so interesting. For example, of a really ambiguous monster, we find monsters in the Bible that are in one section described as adversaries of God and evil, but then in the same section described as creations of God that are working to show his power. So that's just one Christian example, but oftentimes we have these really unclear, characters. We're not sure whether are monsters always evil. Is it in the eye of the beholder, as we saw today? Does it depend on who creates them and what context they're being seen in today? I think that wraps up my talk for this afternoon. I thank you again so much for coming out and listening.